Good morning, Brian.
How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks. As I mentioned just before I hit record, my young son managed to put himself to sleep a couple of times. Not easily, but I consider that great progress. And it's possible we might get an aspect of our lives back because it's been all-consuming.
Right. Well, been there, done that. Not quite to that degree, maybe. I think ours always were pretty good sleepers.
Yeah,
But
yeah. My kids who are now in their 20s didn't have this kind of difficulty with sleeping. Yeah. Yeah. So things are looking up. Did I
yeah,
already ask you how you're doing? I'm still sleep deprived.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and I've been working out
Oh yeah.
because my well batteries died, and the new ones have been shipped. But until then, I'm hauling water with 5-gallon buckets.
Yeah.
Not having to chop wood, but hauling water.
Yeah. Are you sticking with golf cart batteries?
You know what I'm using now are these nice big absorbent class mat batteries.
Yeah.
And when I looked into the lithium, lithium batteries, it turns out not only are they really expensive, but they're also very persnickety. And the thing I like about these AGM is, they're sealed, so you don't have to put water in them. So that's a big relief. Uh, but also they can take abuse. They'll charge and discharge at 4 below 0 and above 140 degrees. Of course, if it's above 140 degrees, we have some other problems to deal with. Get the fire extinguisher. But so they can take abuse and they last long and they're a little bit cheaper and all that good stuff.
I just remembered the charge set points for AGM batteries usually are not as high as flooded lead acid.
Oh, is that
So,
right?
so make sure you're setting your charge controller because if you charge those to too high a voltage, I think that reduces their life expectancy considerably.
Oh, that's good to know because the controller that I have on there is not one that wins much my praise. And it's one of these things that's trying to do 12 and 24, but they don't give you a switch. So if your 24-volt system gets too low, it'll think it's a 12-volt system. And then so you got to get some other way to charge it to get it up over 12 far enough that it knows that it's 24 volt. So stupid. And just really stupid. But thankfully, my whole setup was not engineered very well, I don't think. So I tore it apart and reconfigured it according to my demands. And had this happened to me the way they had set it up, not only would I not be able to pump water from the well to the house, but I also wouldn't be pumping from the well into the tank. But luckily, I reconfigured it in the obvious, like, duh, why would you not do it this way? So at least I have a tank full of water
So the
and
well
my
pump
own.
is more direct.
So the well pump is now solar direct. And, at the volumes that we use, there's no need for batteries. There's no need to have the same power source that I'm using to move the water to be hooked in. It was just like, come on, come on. And but I could go on
Yeah.
about the particular organization that was responsible for that, but I'm not going to do it because I have self control.
I'm intuiting that you might have more skill.
And they sold me a trimetric I didn't need to anyway.
Uh,
That was, but
so I I've been thinking about this topic for the last couple of weeks, and I'm not sure how to distill it really, but I think I mentioned to you that I've been listening to this. I guess it's a ningun, which is like a Jewish ikaro, um, like a it's like a religious folk song kind of, and there are
oh,
hundreds of these. And this one is about truth, and the lyrics basically are like you truth, you're the beginning and the end. Without you, There is no king, there's no redemption, there's no salvation.
Okay.
And it had me thinking back to ceremonies where there were times when things were really heavy. And what I found myself grasping for were kind of like the fundamental human virtues or values. And I remember kind of grasping for words like truth and justice and finding them kind of slippery. Like
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
truth is we talk a lot about its its nature as at once there potentially being some objective truth, but we experience truth and meaning through our five senses that might have limitations, through language that might have limitations, through narratives that might have limitations. And so we're always kind of trying to point at it, but it's very hard to nail down. And I think that's maybe why truth is a religious topic, because it's through like a higher understanding or our experience of higher states of consciousness, however you want to look at that, that we can kind of grok truth, although we can't necessarily convey it, and we can't confirm that we grokked it. We might in the future grok it more deeply, right? Or see a different facet of it where we thought we had grasped it before. So I'm kind of interested in this, not just what is the philosophical understanding of truth, because I think we talk about that a lot, but kind of more specifically, what is the religious understanding of truth, or the relationship between truth and a religious pursuit, maybe?
Yeah. Uh, the way that I see it is sort of, uh, we talked before about the record player. And if we have a record player, for those youngsters out there that don't know about it, it's like a CD player, except it was out there where you could see the thing spinning around.
It's the source of many of these rock and roll references that Brian likes to make.
It's true. Vinyl, they used to call it. Yeah. And so basically, it's a spinning disc. And if we imagine a spinning disc sitting between us and we stuck a candle on one of the edges, so the thing would be spinning like so. And this is one of my sophisticated demonstrations. So, as you'll notice if you're watching us on YouTube or Rumble, my finger's doing a circling movement, but what you see is from the perspective of the camera. So, what you see is a back and forth. And if I were to move the camera behind me and do the same circling, you would say, oh, it's a back and forth, but technically it would be a forth and a back. In other words, the one perspective's forth would be the other perspective's back, and vice versa. So that we could say that this phenomenon, this objective, non non-related to the perspective, right? It has a sort of an autonomous existence, but the truth of it that we perceive is relative to which camera angle we're looking at. Where is back and where is forth? But the big picture is no matter which camera we're looking at, there will be a back and a forth until we start taking a camera picture from above, metaphorically from a higher dimension. And then what we'll see, I will synthesize this with the use of my sophisticated demonstration. Turning at 90 degrees, if we were looking from down, we'd see this. And we'd see, well, maybe we could artificially lay on an up and a down and a left and a right, but really, within the movement itself, there is no stopping point and a starting to move in another direction, which is what the appearance of a back and a forth is. Because this is unambiguous, right? At one point, forth stops and back begins, and then vice versa. Whereas when we look at it sideways, there's no back and forth. We have to artificially lay on the idea of an up and a down. And then we'll know that that's a sloppy categorization because half of those will be moving right and left, and they won't fit into an easy up or down category, right? In other words, we see that that perspective was creating the truth that we experience through our senses. So we might come to understand that our sense perception based truths are locked into a perspective. They're viewed from a point. And this is related to this idea that we beat like a dead horse, that all context is meaning, or all meaning is context based. So we also have within that little demonstration the idea that if we go out of the two dimensions and we go up into a third dimension, that apparent dualities seen at a higher dimension are resolved as unities. Right? Well, that's a formula. What that means is that higher dimension yields a different truth than a lower dimensional viewpoint does. And I think that when we apply that metaphor to our lives, it explains aha experiences. All of a sudden, a new dimension of understanding was revealed to us, and we got an aha out of it. And we see that not only did our lower dimensional perspective not contain an ultimate truth, but that something about the relativity of the truth was locked up in how we were even asking the question. We had presuppositions from that perspective that influenced how we ask the question, what is true and what is not true here? So when we get to mystical texts, and I don't know whether this folk song, if it came from the Psalms or it came from, back in the day where revelation was the the coin of the realm, then the truth that they're talking about is like a truth with a very high hermeneutical bar to clear because it was based on
Theoretically
mystical
the highest.
experience.
Yeah,
In fact,
theoretically the highest,
yes.
which goes to the question, right?
Well, and that goes to the the ultimate coherence of all creation, and that is that highest level of truth. And that's why people say that, well, truth is the ultimate level of truth is on the other side of the abyss, is kind of the Kabbalistic idea in this supernal realm that we can't experience because of our perspectivicity, are being locked in a das sign, right? Being here.
Like the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao.
Right, because we speak from a particular place, and the Tao is everywhere and non-local. And this idea of the highest truth is that it is a coherence, which is to say that it is a higher level in which everything is stuck together with everything else, a higher level of identity where there only is God. There is nothing that's not a manifestation of the highest energies, even in the lowest. That's why when they ask the Zen master, where is the Tao? And he says, it's in the very excrement. This is a academicized translation, right, of a very realistic explanation, right? There's nothing which is not Tao. There's nothing which is not truth. There's nothing which is not Tao. But the trick is all in the perspective with which we see it. Chapter 1 again. Do we see it with passion, quoting Lao Tzu, which is to say, really in that here and nowness perspective, the partness, identifying with the particular and not the general? or without passion, which is to say, there is a way that the Taoists and other sages have found to relate to ultimate reality beyond our locked in little tiny person being here now perspective. That is that there is a possibility of transcendence. This is what the transcendentalists were about. This idea that we can identify to these greater wholes by identifying with the natural world, which is a unpolluted expression of this natural wholeness, uh, coherence.
If I understood correctly in some of our past conversations, the transcendentalists were attempting a secular explanation of ultimate truth. And I'm not sure, it seems like, from my limited perspective, that a secular explanation of truth can't escape, like, doesn't have the escape velocity to get past subjectivity and the five senses and language and narrative and
To
all of the
transcend,
guardrails. Yeah.
in other words.
So how did they try to get past that? How did they try to secularize ultimate truth and ultimate coherence?
Um, I think it's through this other higher function of humanity. And I mean, I leap to the two brains, and that they intuited that there is a state. And remember, these guys were reading the Upanishads, and so they were not. They didn't just fall off the turnip truck, as it were. Although they may have at some point actually been involved with a turnip truck, given their pragmatic, hands-on approach to things. But I think that that's where this contemplative tradition of that manifest maybe is getting lost in nature, um, giving oneself over, surrendering to nature in a certain way, and that. But I think that we're also talking about the unique element. Like we like to point to consciousness, conscious of consciousness, implying that our consciousness is conscious of our own consciousness. But consciousness, conscious of consciousness, uh, maybe I'm thinking about this just because I'm reading Bergson now, and he talks about needing to explain the world through a psychology and not through a physics. And he likes to play with the psychic and physics and the same letters, they're just kind of rearranged. And that in fact everything around us is conscious in terms of the truth as in the highest level of beingness expressing as the created universe. And so consciousness, conscious of consciousness could be interpreted as consciousness capable of being conscious of the inherent consciousness of all creation, which is another level of consciousness even. And when we talked about Ken Wilber and the no boundaries and this idea of the expansion of boundaries, this is the what they would call the unitive experience or the experience of non-duality. And usually it's not you don't just go there. There is a process or I think within the Western contemplative traditions, they would consider it grace because it is a slippery fish. And but I think within the Eastern traditions, there is the understanding that there are stages to this that are navigable, and people that have gone on those stages can leave breadcrumbs, as it were, that enable other people, maybe pitons. You still have to climb, but at least there's something that's solid that you can link into every periodically. It's maybe a good image for that. And so, truth conceptualized and truth experienced, there's a distinction there. The truth that the left brain experiences and the truth that the right brain experiences. Truth as propositional and truth as dispositional, we've spoken about before. Do I live out of truth? Do I live within truth? Or is it something that's a package in my left brain that I gibber out of my mouth? And there's a perceptual difference as well as a conceptual difference with those two experiences.
So I think one of the ways that we think about truth, if we're emphasizing making objective truth, like through a hermeneutical process, more and more refined, so we can use the scientific method to hone in on um, making truth more and more accurate in certain realms, and meaning the external, right, the objective world, the
Well,
physical.
it's even smaller than that. It's really inert matter. We're good at inert matter. And again, this is Bergson. He says, that's why he thought we shouldn't be called Homo sapiens. We should be called Homo faber, because our intelligence, as opposed to instinct, is directed on the fabrication of things, the creation of things. And that as a result, I've talked about this before about how we partify things, how we say, oh, that's not one thing, that's a bird and that's a tree and that's a river, instead
Yeah,
of the
what Bohm called fragmentation.
what Bohm called fragmentation, and that there is actually another level of there's a whole software set that can be run that's about coherence, that's about defragging, right? Which became popular only several years ago, right? In the history of humans. Um, but the parallel is there. We don't Our brain doesn't work completely or correctly if we're badly in need of defragging our hard drive. Right? It puts bumps in our processing. Well, this is a similar idea that some other capacity needs to be applied when we move away from inert matter, and that we're not really made for it. It's too mobile, basically, is what he says.
Hmm.
Too changeable, because we want to think in frozen states, and that we even represent movement to ourselves as a series of frozen states. Like we want to break up time into this minute and that minute and this minute and this point in time and this. Well, it's like a river. You can't do that to a river. Why would you think you could do that with time?
I think you're partly answering the question I was going to ask, but maybe let me post up the rest of it, and because I think that might take you in a little bit different direction too. So I think that the rational approach is to try to take more territory, collecting objective facts, collecting facts about reality, and maybe that relates primarily to inert things, but I think, a rationalist would say no, there's things about living systems that we can also establish as fact, and we can kind of drive some ambiguity out of that. um like, yeah, I mean, I won't
Yeah.
waste your time with
Some,
examples.
but it'll never be physics.
And I think maybe the impression is that as the rational worldview takes more territory by adding more facts, it's making smaller the territory of the unknown. When in fact, what can't be covered by facts isn't being shrunken at all by the extension of the objective into a greater territory or a greater list of facts. So that's one,
Precisely the opposite. Yeah.
maybe the opposite, which is interesting. And
Yeah.
then the other set is, um, if if the objective worldview is, um, let's come back to that. Maybe react to what I said so far, especially your comment just now about maybe it's even making the unknown greater.
Well, I think that what you're pointing to here is what all things are filled with God's guy talked about taking a an investigative methodology, again, ideally applied to inert matter, and turning it into a metaphysic. And that metaphysic looks like it is popularly expressed as if one were to have a, an infinite calculating capacity and one were to know the condition of every particle in existence, then one could predict all of the future by just simply doing the math of all these billiard balls bouncing in and that, and that's that famous promissory note that I'm talking about. Uh, I also have referred to this maybe in John Dewey's formulation, the quest for certainty. We've referred to it with Levinas and that drive to totalize. Uh, it's the effort to try to make the number pi into a rational number and not realizing that all you're ever getting is an approximation. All you're ever measuring is your approximation, not your that is your ability to approximate, not your actual measurements, right? So there is something that is ultimately so slippery about the ultimate reality of things that it cannot be grasped. And this is probably the other side of this idea that humans can't look on the face of God. Uh, there is something else that's happening there at that level. This is like we talk about complicated and then going to complex. Well, this is like complex on steroids because complex can all happen within one set of dimensions. Right. And this is like,
Complex involves dualities, maybe a huge set of dualities, but you're talking about post duality, right? Yeah.
I'm talking about hyperdimensional non-grokkability.
What do you
Yeah.
think about the humans can't look upon the face of God or say the name of God is another one? Like that strikes me as a pretty easy metaphor to, but it also is really specific and seems to me to have more meanings than just the metaphorical one,
Well,
perhaps.
there's two meanings that I take off the top. One is you can't get there from here. That famous
You
main
just physically can't do it.
you can't.
Right.
So the way that translates is if you lose the you part, you may.
Okay.
So, but you're not going to do it the way you're youing you now. But there might be non-Ewing ways of being that can
Well,
be experienced. I've got to be careful with my pronouns here. um, so, so who has the experience, right? Or uh, how much can one surrender to God? I'm thinking of when Ram Dass gave the mega dose of LSD to Neem Karoli. And he said many yogis couldn't take this medicine because they cannot completely surrender to God. And so that idea of surrendering to God is taking the you out. And so if you aren't there anymore, no, maybe the limits go with that. That tends to be the implication coming out of some Hindu and Buddhist perspectives.
and I, I've had glimpses of that in ceremonies, where I started to separate from myself, right, or just lose the seat of perspective, and then it got scary, and I had to come back.
And that's how we also are conscious of our own consciousness is by experience that feels like stepping outside of it. When really, I think it's maybe just a bigger expression of ourselves looking down at a smaller expression. So maybe for a moment, we're identifying with that higher self, and then we can see the things that happened to us as not us, as opposed to it actually making us who we are.
So do you think it's kind of part of the fault, the flaw in religion, that this emphasis is placed on awe and a separation from, which kind of, you know, begs the assumption that, well, you can't get there, so you're better off having the attitude of awe and reverence, as in, I'm never going to get there, I couldn't possibly understand it, I tremble before the idea, and so don't even say the name of, and don't even try to look at the face of. Do you think that's like a flawed intervention? Because it seems
Well,
like
that's where I made reference before to the two types of Buddhism, and I'll dig out what those classical terms are. But the one means trusting others, and the other is myself and power. And I think those are the two paths you have. You either you want to know about Europe, you either go there or you read books and hear stories of people who did. That's about it, right? And then you're trusting others because you're getting the viewpoint from their perspective as opposed to one that you would have yourself.
I'm asking if you think religion concluded that one of those paths is better than the other.
I think that there may well be a sort of a practical approach to this, and that is that the bell curve exists on every basic human capacity, and maybe the capacity for spiritual revelation is no different than that. So that what that means is that as the bell curve of spiritual growth moves through history, that at some point the leading edge of that curve started being able to attain Buddhahood. And then they started able to come back and tell us, oh, yeah, don't take any wooden nickels. Don't goof off. Don't, don't look at my finger. All those famous sayings. Um, but that doesn't mean that it's not a reach. You might have remembered me talking about this guy with the mind matter integration equations who had Jacob's ladder, and this idea that everybody is progressing up this ladder, and that based on the impacts and their nervous system's response to it, they're slowly work their way up to higher and higher dimensions of perception. And so the idea is, like I mentioned this before, also the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, where I think Devi and Shiva are talking, and I think Shiva says to Devi, within this, there is a method for every human that ever was, is, or will ever be. And there are so many of these, and those are taken to be these different stages so that everybody's on there somewhere, and there's some method to bring you to the next level. But, for some of those people, that next level might be the guidance of religion. And if you don't have a direct seeing in with clarity, then you need law rules like never and always. And but part of what Nietzsche was talking about when he talked about beyond good and evil, that was a prelude to the new philosophers, meaning that they get to a point where they see directly. They don't need rules about this is what's good and this is what's evil. They actually experience it in its isness. So then naturally their behavior is not, out of correct parameters because of the clarity that's just there manifested through their love of wisdom as philosophers, right? Because who willingly uh, does A when they know that B is better serves them on the highest levels of that can be. aware, right? So yeah, I mean, there's this idea that some people need to be told real obvious stuff, and other people are on to the very higher subtle levels, and we do best if they're genuine, we do best to take their counsel. Uh, and I think that this gets again. You can imagine this maybe on a tribal level working better. In the old days, a parish priest. Well, in a little village, she's not going to get away with everything, with anything. Everybody knows what's what. They know a good man, they know a not good man. And so maybe there's an immediacy of who you should take the advice of and who you shouldn't. But nowadays, with the numbers the way they are, this becomes a very complicated hermeneutical process to be able to sort out to make the correct interpretations of the information that we're given.
You said something earlier that I think I asked you to explain more, and I'm not sure I got the explanation, or maybe we switched gears a little bit. So when I suggested that people who are trying to um, conquer more territory for the objective worldview by expanding the universe of known facts, I think you said they might actually be increasing the size of the territory of the unknowable.
Oh,
Or
yeah.
how are they increasing that territory? Because I foolishly think of that as kind of like a universe of a given size for whatever, by the limitations of my own consciousness.
Yeah, because they get closer and closer to the fundamental mysteries that are unexplainable. So those mysteries become larger, the logos.
Okay.
And that's why they're banging up against the limits that they are, I think. And why we're seeing people like Fajin and again, I gotta give it to my man Henri Bergson, because he really does sort of solve that problem of, you have what he calls finalism, which is to say that, oh, there's a goal and all of evolution is heading to this goal. And then you have like what you could call accidentalism. And that is, it's like, well, it's just all billiard balls bouncing into each other and it happens to accumulate in complexity and it happens to come alive and it happens to generate consciousness and which is all just these happy accidents. And those are like the two poles. And he's like, well, obviously neither of those poles is right. And so and I'm not to the end yet. I'm in the thick of it. But he really is kind of trying to come at it from a scientific evolutionary viewpoint, but the conclusions that he comes to are very different. And that's where this idea of the whole universe is psychism, not physics. The psychism is what explains the physics. The physics doesn't explain the psychism, which is again not to say that there is a final end. Uh, which is why evolution goes like a tree that branches out, as opposed to a system that homes in on one perfect life form, so to speak. Right? This idea is exploring everything and all the variations, but that there is this emergent idea. We talked about this when we talked about the experiment with the fruit flies and them taking out the genes for eyes. And after about 14 generations, the eyes showed back up without any genes being present. These are the kinds of problems. Like when you didn't have this idea of genes, you didn't have this idea that you had answered the questions. You didn't have the kinds of unknown problems and questions like, well, where did these damn eyeballs come from? And, you know, so every solved mystery has a way of opening up a deeper level of either the old mysteries or new ones. And because it's pursuing this idea of totalization or of that promissory note that everything is figure outable, everything is deterministic. So every time the non-deterministic, shows up, it's going to have an issue.
What
And
happens if you kind of run that pattern in reverse, and let's say you cultivate greater and greater um, relationship to truth in the subjective, meaning that you develop methods of attaining higher states of consciousness. You explore your own shadow and integrate, material that might exist there. You cultivate shared understanding and shared meaning with others, right? And kind of have some experience of what collective self awareness might entail. What does that do to the universe of the rational and objective and the things that can be measured and known? Nothing?
I don't think that it necessarily does much. I think it changes the premise upon which we understand it. It puts it in its place, so to speak, and which is the proper job of philosophy, right? That usher function, putting things in their place. It keeps it in its appropriate quadrant. But just that you start with the idea of objective is sort of setting it on the premise that needs to be challenged.
Same one.
And that, well, that is that subjective objective question. Um, the I suppose you could argue on one hand, there is no such thing as objective because everything has to come through, but there are confirmable subjective experiences that one can share with others. Let's put it that way, maybe. Um, because ultimately it's going to come through our perspective machine, right? Um, the argument might be made that as you get higher consciousness, it becomes less subjective and more objective through the expansion of the perspective of the self. When the self becomes the universe, then subject and object completely collapse. That idea. So, assuming there might be a slider in there instead of a switch,
Mhm.
uh, the idea would be that subjectivity and objectivity are not black and white, but that they're just differing degrees of gray.
So how we think about history is a great example of that, because we'd like to believe that um, that very particular things happened, and in fact, it's essential for us to believe that this happened, then this happened, because we base our um, identity in the deepest sense on that,
Yep, yep.
or the almost deepest sense. Um, and yet, from a philosophical standpoint, the past doesn't exist and the future doesn't exist. And uh,
And A never caused B, and B was never caused by A.
and everything about our understanding of history is must be through interpretation, ours and others, and ours of others.
And
Right?
not just interpretation, but distillation,
Yeah.
throwing out a lot more than we pick.
Most of the subjective material, for example. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and also because everything's like a version of Rashomon by Kurosawa, where you have four different accountings of the crime. And this idea that science loves to say, well, A caused this, and you know, I can't remember who pointed this out first, but in fact, that never happens. There's always a million A's causing a million B's, and they're all happening like that. And the only way that we get an A causes B out of it is through this intellectual process of partifying, taking out one mechanism. And yes, there is some truth to A causing B when we extract that mechanism, but we can't mistake that extraction for the reality that A and B live in, which is in the morass of A subprime 1 to A subprime infinity or whatever, so that we're always doing a simplification. We're always doing a leaving out. It's always the coast of Norway problem. And so we can't base it. We can't write any promissory notes on that, especially not metaphysical ones, right? We need another mode. And
So, how do you think about history from knowing that both that causality is that of a complex living system, not linear, and that all everything that happened in the past still only exists in the present through how we remember it or it,
through its effect.
have
Yeah,
experienced it or yeah.
right.
So and yet we always refer to history as having these relatively objective components.
Well, and in reality, the realest, alivest part of history is us and our Weltanschauung. Use a nice, good German word. Our worldview, our understanding of ourselves and our lives is the culmination of world history. It's the part of world history that lives.
Yeah.
And it's not, I mean, to me, what is more germane is the level and state of consciousness of the average person, more so than George Washington crossing the Delaware, Christmas Eve or whatever. And because really those events kind of become placeholders for these bigger changes in the worldview. And so hidden in here somewhere is another argument to say that the purpose of life really is the evolution of consciousness.
I'm curious to hear you make that connection, and I'm also, I'm what's coming up for me is the the increase in the last couple of years in anti-Semitism in the United States and in the West in general is like 400% or something, so much of the Jewish community is very keyed towards uh, that's how the environment developed in Germany in the 30s and likewise in other places at other times, and never forget, right? And we have to pay attention, and we need to be talking about this, and we all that
Sure.
kind of stuff. And that part of me bristles at the idea that history is entirely subjective, because if we let go of no, that shit really happened, then we potentially increase the risk of it happening again.
Well, it's about what do we fixate on when we're looking for lessons from history? And it's always easiest to fixate on the negative aspects because our sense of disgust is so leveraged within our behavior system. But for example, what people don't know is uh, that before those times in Europe of Nazism, there was like a great love affair between the Jewish race and the German race because they both had a penchant for a type of intellectual exploration that was not easily found just anywhere in the world. And so that's why, we slap on Heidegger for becoming a Nazi, which he did say was the biggest mistake he ever made in his life. Uh, but he dedicated his major work, Time and Being, to Edmund Husserl, who was Jewish, who lost his seat that Heidegger took over because he was Jewish. But then, Levinas was also Jewish, and he was a student of Heidegger, and I believe was Hannah Arendt also, uh, because she was a student of Heidegger also. So that the intellectual connection somehow ran deeper even than the politics did. And the same story happens with slavery in the United States. And there's a lot of negativity about, the all the negative aspects of slavery. And I'm not making any arguments that there's anything good about slavery, just like I'm not making any
This is
arguments that
that kind of podcast.
there's anything good about Nazism. But what I will say is that there was this long history of collaboration and coordination between the black and white races, using that, circumscribed term. Uh, that wasn't just enmity. You don't let your blood enemies nurse your babies. You don't have the type of intertwined life that existed in those days, uh, if everything is just hate filled. Which is not to say that there weren't, plenty of negative, experiences there, and that this, it's a false basis for a human relationship, slavery. But that doesn't mean that there weren't strong and important relationships. What was that movie, Driving Miss Daisy?
Mhm.
It's one of those things that sort of shows that. Or, the other thing that leaps to mind with that is the story of Muscle Shoals, which was happening in some really racially difficult times, but you had some just unbelievable artistic, collaboration happening between whites and blacks.
I don't know
Like
this.
just Muscle Shoals,
Correct.
the Swampers. Uh, there's a great documentary. I will dig a link out about Muscle Shoals, which was a recording studio down in the South that had a studio band. I think that was the Swampers. And this may I'll put in the song where the Swampers make their appearance in, is it Leonard Skinner maybe? Uh, well, Muscle Shoals, we got the
Oh,
Swampers.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Sweet Home Alabama. Yeah.
Sweet Home Alabama, yeah, and, but some great, and I'll dig it out, all the great black musicians that played in Muscle Shoals that recorded some. I mean, it was an incredible time of, artistic exploration and explosion that we still are the benefactors or beneficiaries of, and so, at the same time, there was all this intense racism. But within the world of musicians, there was something stronger there that was a bond that enabled this intense collaboration to come out. That was just amazing, you know?
I don't
Um,
know if it's. I mean, so I think the point about individual examples of human connection transcending enmity is a core part of human history and a core part of our identity as a result.
and a part often forgotten, I think is my
Yeah.
point. Yeah.
I don't know if that means that the focus on how bad could shit get is overblown. Um, you know, I don't know.
I think it just sucks all the air out of the room, and what we probably need to do is drill down a little more on the coastline there, and we might find that within more nuance, we find a way to untangle the knot that's there, because these things have sort of metastasized into something
Mhm.
instead of healing. And so I guess I'm just saying that we maybe have an intuition when we see something to just, to look away, the leverage of disgust. And what we might need to do is actually kind of, grit our teeth and look at it. Like I remember Goethe talking about being really disgusted with himself that he kept going to watch these dissections of human cadavers, and he kept getting sick. But you know that his impulse to disgust was standing in the way of his learning, and that really pissed him off. And he desensitized himself to it because he needed the learning, damn it. And I'm kind of saying a similar sort of thing like that. Like we really do need to understand the psychology. And this is the idea of if you don't understand it, you're not likely to relive it. And but I think understanding it is more than just condemning it. Condemning it puts it at a distance and it makes it so other that we might we might start harboring illusions about our own psychology, and those illusions might actually be the doorway that opens to those kinds of places. Um, so so maybe it's just the developing the visceral integrity to unflinchingly look at the difficult things. That's what ceremonies is all about. And in general, we come out better off and less bamboozled by it, less gut reaction, and more with the visceral integrity to take it on and to see it when its seeds are still small. Whereas if we're always in the habit of looking away, we may not ever resolve it. Um, you know,
Yeah.
and I think I have an impulse to whenever I get an explanation that is like the common explanation of things, I want to go see the reality and just to do the juxtaposition of the two. That's partly why I went to Africa, because I wanted to see for myself what was the deal, because I knew that. And it isn't necessarily a critique to say that the parts we remember or the things we write stories about or the things that make it into the newspaper are only the good or only the bad or all that. It's just that the reality is so dimensional that no representation of it can catch it. No map of Norway has the reality of the coastline of Norway. And but when you go to Norway, so many extra dimensions are going to flood into you about the reality of the coastline of Norway. That the squiggle on the map is, it's just not even the tiniest bit of the reality of it. And that's just the problem of the logistics of it, I think.
Hmm.
But I think that in looking at difficult situations, and particularly of mass psychology, we have to be able to look at it honestly. And when it's packed with so much human interest for things to go one way or the other, because people's worlds are riding on it, it's pretty difficult to look at things with clear lenses. And you know so there's some reckoning with ourselves that we have to come to that.
Hmm.
And maybe to the degree that we don't come to that reckoning with ourselves, it plays out in the outer world. And I guess I'm feeling a lot of that lately.
Hmm.
uh, not just particularly around anti-Semitism, uh, but just in general, that a lot of suppressed material manifesting. And I don't know whether that's the speeding up of things through the hyper novelty of the media, but it seems like that's just the process, right? Is that it churns up material, and then a lot of that material has gnashing of teeth, but it's learning curve, you know,
Yeah.
and
I don't know. So I take the point about the coastline of Norway and that looking away, whether it's disgust or fear or whatever, is problematic, and we have to find ways to lean in and understand better. I don't know that that answers my question, and I don't know that I agree that. So So like the greater perspective that incorporates is something along the lines of the death of millions of people, while it might be uh, no basis for a human relationship, to use your phrase about slavery. Um, Also, in the long run, I think you said it was Krishna who said about war that um, you know you just have to go through it and it's fine, right?
And it's not the ultimate truth.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
I mean, so I dig that. I don't know how to reconcile that with like stomaching massive suffering. I think we're still kind of um, responsible, whether we should be or not, to try to prevent that. And I don't know that preventing it is a coastline of Norway problem per se. I think uh, anti-Semitism in particular, it's not the only example of this, but it is a it is a particular thing that arises again and again in certain situations. And for whatever reason, um, especially when we think about people as privileged or oppressed, for example, which is a woke thing, but is not new to the woke movement.
No, no.
We can hate those who are privileged, and we can hate those who are oppressed. And Jews occupy a unique position where they can be seen as either at any time. And there are other people that might fall into that category. And the,
History is filled with them. Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know how much better that needs to be understood. Um, Maybe,
Sure.
but I I think the root of the question was, if we think about history as, since we can only experience it today, we can only experience it through narrative. We can only experience it through our subjective lenses. That creates a tremendous risk for repeating it.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, but look at it. For example, we have long held the doctrine of the separation of church and state. And,
It's kind of a
you know,
version of
you
the same problem, isn't it?
it's a version of it, isn't it? And the argument could be made that the situation with Israel and Iran is that the idea of religious states is not one that's functional. And that one can't, for example, have both a religious state and a democracy, um, because you're elevating a certain doctrine. And I think this comes down to, again, doctrine or principle.
I think that's maybe a debate that we ought to have, not on this episode, because I don't,
Oh, it's a huge topic. It's a huge topic.
yeah,
Yeah.
but um, the the separation of church and state, where I thought you were going, is that the church represents the subjective end of the spectrum, and state represents the objective end in that case. And by dis um, entangling those, or pretending to disentangle those, you lose meaning, right? You lose the
Oh, uh-huh.
the source of meaning or the source of morality.
Right.
Uh,
No, I was gonna say the opposite. I was gonna say that whenever you get one cult's particular story of truth, you lose all the possibility of any other viewpoint,
mm.
and that's where the idea of democracy, and individual rights, and this plugs into that whole story with the Reformation also. The Reformation in its own way was another little like, church and state, but the state was the personal soul. And the idea that there was a universal priesthood, that each human had their own relationship with God. Now there are no religious authorities. You might take counsel, but no one is considered to have a higher viewpoint of religion than anybody else. That was the basic one of the many arguments of the Reformation. And and I argue that there is a theme through history that's empowering the expression of the individual, that shows up as the American Revolution, shows up as the Reformation, shows up as maybe the original Christian Revolution, or um, but that there are some problems with that's where the origin of the conflict with the religious state is, that you start to create, even if you allow people that don't share the same thing, if they become de facto second class citizens, then you don't really have a democracy. And
Well,
so the question is
again,
where your values are.
I
Yeah.
don't agree with that characterization, and anti-Semitism obviously predates the existence of a Jewish state. But
Absolutely. And in fact, I don't think that this is even that new. Like, I think this goes all the way back. Like, I like explanations for the Anasazi and the tribal thing that went in the Southwest. There were clearly religious elements to that, and the things coming up from the South, and to this day, you've got different stories about what happened. And whether there are even any Anasazi ancestors, and some people say no, and some people say yes, and again, also, it's connected to real world interests, and so we don't know what are all the vested interests that people hold when they're asking those questions. You know, uh, Same thing all throughout Africa. I think this is one of the reasons that Africa is has been so slow to develop. Has been that the And I think particularly it's related to language also. But you have so many different language groups. You have so many different viewpoints of things. The idea that you can amalgamate them into one thing enough to leverage political power means that you're kind of creating a standard that everybody, a purity test that everybody has to measure up to. So I think we humans have been doing this a long time, and that there is something about, maybe it's tribal psychology in general that drives it, that othering process that we talked about. But I think it's an old one, and uh, so yeah, I mean, truth in light of that, and where does that show up? Because that shows up to me as something pretty down on the subjective end of the ladder, and that, or maybe that's an assumption, psycho spiritual assumption, that as we move up that ladder, we become more universal in our perspectives. We're more likely to relate to humanity as a whole, as opposed to my particular subsect of this particular sect of this particular, which
yeah,
is
or
that
both.
fragmentation.
There's an integration.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
we don't have to lose our individual identity to merge. That's the
right,
part whole thing. Yeah.
right, right. And but we can see that imbalance in either the part or the whole, and we end up with either complete chaos or goose stepping around everywhere, all dressed the same. And we still see that tendency, and we still see it within religions, even when people making up new religions, right? I can't help but think
Because
of,
it's a facet of the human, not of the religion. Yeah.
yeah, of a psychological dynamic that has to do with all these the mysteries of identity and the self. And that's why I say that we are kind of human history. How it all shows up in us
Hmm.
is sort of like you can have this long, complicated formula, and at the end is equals this,
Hmm.
right? And so somehow this equals all of the rest of that formula, and then what does it beget? Because we know the tree by its fruit, right? And so So no, and that's why I think human history is so important, and psychology is important, and philosophy is important, and religion is important, and but that it's what's real important, I think, is that all of those move the ball in legitimate ways that generate a more cohesive picture, and I do think that that's inevitable. That's a promissory note that I will write. But as far as doing the math to the whole universe with a supercomputer, nah, not so much. Even with AI, I don't think Al can help us with this one.
Yeah.
No.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it there for today. And
Mhm.
it's interesting that the question about truth opens up these areas of a lack of um, coherence, let's say, or at least that's my sense with some of these threads, that there's a lot more to explore or to be said about them, and that we aren't necessarily seeing the same thing in the same way. So it's um,
And that there's a mirror thing between our own internal coherence and the coherence that manifests in the world around us, which is a real facet. That's that microcosm macrocosm thing that uh I think of the saying that a pickpocket only when a pickpocket sees people walk by, all he sees are pockets. you know, and that we're all kind of doing our own version of that, and that's generating our own reality,
mhm.
and with all these things levering on it in our cognitive model. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
We're through the fog.
Yeah.
Talk to you everybody later. Bye bye.